Okay, so you see all these trucks on the road, and you might think, oh, that's the trucking industry. But there's actually a lot going on, a lot more than meets the eye, right? And I know our listeners like to stay ahead of the curve on these big shifts that are happening. So that's what we're going to cover in today's deep dive.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really fascinating time of the trucking industry. Things are changing. We're seeing a real transformation in how goods are transported. And we've been looking at a lot of research, articles, and market analyses. And we want to boil it down to the essentials for you so you understand what's really going on and what it means for the future.
So consider this your crash course on trucking, no pun intended. So let's start with what our research points to as one of the big stories in trucking right now, this idea of market concentration, how the competitive landscape is shifting and how that's playing out in different segments of the industry.
Yeah, and one of the big trends we're seeing is towards consolidation. Fewer but larger companies are kind of starting to dominate certain segments. And this is particularly noticeable in what's called less than truckload shipping.
So that's LTL, right?
Yeah, LTL. And the intermodal transport as well.
Okay, so maybe unpack those terms for us a little bit because I think they're really important to understand what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so less than truckload. Think of it as shipping, where you've got goods from multiple different businesses all going on the same truck. So it's not like a full truckload dedicated to just one customer. That's why it's less than a full truckload. And then when we talk about intermodal, think of it as combining different modes of transportation. It might start on a truck, then go on a train for a long distance, and then back on a truck for the final delivery.
Oh, like a relay race for your freight?
Exactly, like a relay race. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You get the efficiency of rail for those long hauls, and then the flexibility of trucks for that first and last mile to get the goods exactly where they need to be.
That makes sense. So how does this idea of consolidation tie into this?
Well, what we're seeing is that fewer companies are kind of controlling a larger portion of the market in both LTL and intermodal.
So less competition, does that mean higher prices?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest that historically, in markets where LTL services have been more consolidated, we have seen prices tend to go up. So that is something to keep an eye on, but it's not just about prices. Some argue that this consolidation could actually lead to some benefits as well, in terms of streamlined operations and potentially more integrated services, making things a little easier for customers in the long run.
It's interesting to consider both sides of that. And what are some of the ways that we see this consolidation playing out? Well, one way is through acquisitions. Larger companies buying up smaller firms to expand their reach and their market share. We also see strategic partnerships forming, especially in the LTL sector, where companies team up to leverage each other's strengths.
So it's not just about one giant company gobbling everyone up.
Yeah.
It's also about like strategic alliances and different ways of working together.
Right. It's a more nuanced picture than just, one big fish swallowing all the little fish.
Yeah.
And another big piece of this consolidation story is technology.
So tech really is reshaping everything. How is it playing out in the trucking world specifically?
Yeah, tech is really becoming central to competition. Companies are realizing they need to adopt new technologies to stay ahead of the game, and these strategic partnerships we mentioned are often focused on that. For example, there are companies like Truckstop and 10 Street that are offering all sorts of AI-driven solutions for the trucking industry.
So what does that mean for the average person out there, maybe someone who's listening to this who doesn't work in trucking? Like, how does this AI stuff actually affect them? Well, think of it this way. AI can be used to optimize routes in real time. Like, it can factor in traffic, weather, all those things that can slow down a truck. And that means deliveries can be made more efficiently. So you might get your package a little faster, or maybe the cost of shipping goes down because trucks are wasting less fuel sitting in traffic. AI can also be used to manage drivers better, make sure they're getting enough rest and driving safely. And it can even predict when a truck might need maintenance before it breaks down on the side of the road.
That's pretty incredible when you think about it. So it's not just about replacing drivers with robots, it's about making the whole system smarter and more efficient.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the key things to understand about AI. It's not always about replacing humans. It's often about augmenting what humans can do and making the whole process more efficient.
Now, along with those partnerships, we also see a fair amount of M&A activity, right? Mergers and acquisitions.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And one of the examples our sources highlight is Platform Science acquiring Trimble's telematics division.
Okay, now I gotta admit, I don't really know what telematics is. Is that like tracking devices on the trucks?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's about using technology to monitor trucks and drivers. So it's about collecting data in real time from the vehicle and the person behind the wheel.
So what kind of data are we talking about? Is this like where they went, how fast they drove, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it can include things like location, speed, but also things like braking, fuel consumption, even engine diagnostics. It's a whole lot of data that can be used for all sorts of purposes.
So it sounds like it's about more than just Big Brother watching the drivers.
Right, it's definitely not just about that. In fact, telematics is actually really important for safety. By tracking driving behavior, companies can identify risky habits and provide training to improve safety. It can also be used to make sure drivers are taking their required breaks and not exceeding their driving hours, to prevent fatigue-related accidents.
So it's about compliance with regulations and keeping drivers safe.
Absolutely. And it's also about maintenance. By monitoring the health of the engine and other systems in real time, you can often predict when something might need to be fixed before it actually breaks down. That can prevent costly repairs and downtime for the truck and keep those goods moving.
That makes a lot of sense. So when we see a big player like Platform Science buying up a telematics company, it's not just about getting bigger, it's about getting more data and more sophisticated in how they use it.
Exactly. It's about strengthening their technological capabilities and gaining a competitive edge.
Yeah.
So you can really see how all of this is kind of an arms race in a way. Companies are trying to get bigger, acquire more data, and use AI to optimize their operations.
So we've talked a lot about these internal forces shaping the trucking industry, but it's not just about what's happening within the industry, right? The broader economy plays a huge role too, and our sources really highlight that.
Oh, absolutely. The trucking industry is very much tied to the overall health of the economy.
Mm.
When the economy is doing well, businesses need to ship more goods, so demand for trucking goes up. And when the economy slows down, demand for trucking tends to soften as well. And on top of that, government policies, especially things like tariffs and interest rates, can have a big impact on the trucking industry.
Let's break those down a bit. Tariffs first. Those are the taxes on imported goods, right?
Exactly.
So how do tariffs affect the trucking industry, and how could that trickle down to the average person who's maybe listening to this?
Well, if a new tariff is put in place on, say, imported electronics, that could make those electronics more expensive for businesses to import. So that might mean fewer electronics being shipped into the country. And that means less work for trucking companies who transport those goods from the ports to warehouses and stores.
So fewer trucks on the road, less demand for drivers, and potentially higher prices for consumers on those electronics.
Yeah, that's one possible scenario. Or another possibility is that businesses might start looking for alternative sources for those electronics. Maybe they'll start importing them from a different country that doesn't have those tariffs. And that could mean different shipping routes and different demands for trucking services.
So it creates a lot of uncertainty. Like it's hard for trucking companies to predict what's going to happen when these new tariffs are introduced.
Exactly. It disrupts those established supply chains and makes it harder to plan ahead. And our sources actually suggest that a lot of trucking companies are anticipating some slowdowns as a result of these tariffs. They're kind of bracing themselves for some bumps in the road as these new trade policies play out.
So it's not just about the trucking industry itself, it's about how it's all connected to the global economy and global trade.
Exactly. It's all intertwined.
Now let's talk about interest rates. How do those affect the trucking industry?
Well, interest rates are basically the cost of borrowing money. And in the trucking industry, a lot of companies rely on financing to buy new trucks or expand their fleets.
So when interest rates go up, it becomes more expensive for them to borrow that money.
Exactly. And that can really affect their ability to invest in their business. If they can't afford to buy new trucks or upgrade their equipment, that can hurt their ability to compete and stay profitable.
And new trucks aren't cheap, right? I mean, those are big investments.
Oh yeah, they can be incredibly expensive, especially with all the new technology that's being incorporated into trucks these days. So when interest rates rise, it really puts a squeeze on trucking companies.
So they might be more hesitant to expand their fleets or adopt new technologies if it means taking on a lot of expensive debt.
Exactly. And our sources point out that many trucking companies are taking a more cautious approach right now because of these rising interest rates. They're really having to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of any major investments.
So it's a delicate balancing act for them.
Definitely. And it's not just interest rates and tariffs. They also have to deal with things like rising fuel costs and increasing competition for drivers. There's a shortage of truck drivers right now, so companies were having to offer higher wages and better benefits to attract and retain drivers.
It sounds like there are a lot of challenges facing the trucking industry, but it's also an industry that's essential to our economy, right?
Absolutely. It's the backbone of our supply chain. Almost everything we buy, from the food we eat to the clothes we wear, was transported by truck at some point. So the health of the trucking industry really matters to all of us.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how all of these forces we've been discussing are actually playing out in the freight market itself.
Okay, so when we look at the freight market, one of the key trends we see is increasing complexity. It's not a simple, straightforward picture anymore.
What do you mean by complexity?
Well, one aspect of that is the uneven recovery from the pandemic. Different sectors of the economy are recovering at different rates. And that means demand for trucking services is fluctuating in different ways depending on the sector.
Okay, so can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, so for instance, industrial manufacturing and real estate, those sectors have actually bounced back pretty quickly from the pandemic. So there's been a surge in demand for trucking services to transport things like building materials and manufactured goods.
But not every sector has rebounded so quickly, right?
Right. Retail, for example, has been a bit slower to recover. So the demand for trucking services to move consumer goods to stores has been more uneven.
So for trucking companies, it's not just about having enough trucks and drivers. It's about having them in the right place at the right time to meet these shifting demands.
Exactly. It requires a lot more flexibility and agility.
So how are trucking companies adapting to this more complex market?
Well, one of the big ways is through data analytics. They're increasingly using data to try to predict and manage these fluctuations in demand.
So it's like they're trying to become fortune tellers.
In a way, yeah. They're trying to use data to get a better sense of what's coming down the road. For example, they might look at historical data to see how demand for trucking services typically changes during certain times of year. Like, the fall is usually a busy time for shipping because retailers are stocking up for the holidays.
Right, everyone's getting ready for those holiday deliveries.
Exactly. So by analyzing this data, trucking companies can try to anticipate those peak periods and make sure they have enough capacity to handle the increased demand.
So that might mean hiring more drivers, adding more trucks to their fleet, or maybe even adjusting their pricing to reflect the higher demand.
Right. And data can also be used to optimize routes, to avoid congestion and delays. It can also be used to manage inventory more effectively and make sure they have the right amount of goods in the right places at the right time.
So it's all about using data to become more efficient and responsive to the changing needs of the market.
Exactly. Data is really becoming a key differentiator in the trucking industry. Companies that can harness data effectively are going to have a real advantage.
Now, one of the other big changes our sources point to is the shift in how long-haul freight is being moved. There's a lot of talk about the rise of rail and intermodal transport. What's driving that trend?
So there are a couple of key factors at play here. One is cost. For long-haul shipments, rail can often be significantly cheaper than trucking, especially when you're moving large volumes of goods.
And why is rail cheaper?
Well, trains are just more fuel efficient than trucks, especially over long distances. They can move a lot more freight with less fuel. And that's becoming increasingly important as fuel prices continue to fluctuate.
Yeah, it's not just about the price at the pump. It's also about reducing reliance on fossil fuels and reducing emissions.
Right. Sustainability is becoming a bigger factor as well.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of driver shortages. We talked earlier about the lack of truck drivers. Well, that's especially acute in the long-haul sector.
So using rail for those long hauls can help alleviate some of that pressure on the driver pool.
Exactly. And intermodal transportation, which combines rail and trucking, is also becoming increasingly popular.
So we talked about that earlier. Intermodal is like the relay race, right? Where the goods might start on a truck, then go on a train, then back on a truck for the final delivery.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And it's becoming a really attractive option for businesses that are looking for a more efficient and cost-effective way to move their goods over long distances.
So does this mean that trucks are becoming obsolete?
No, not at all. Trucking is still absolutely essential, especially for those shorter hauls and for time-sensitive deliveries. If you need something delivered quickly, a truck is still the best option. And trucks are also crucial for that last-mile delivery, getting the goods from the rail yard or the warehouse to the final destination.
So it's not about one mode of transportation replacing another. It's about them working together in a more integrated way.
Exactly. It's about using the right mode of transportation for the right job.
And this shift towards intermodal and rail, it's really forcing trucking companies to adapt, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They need to be able to integrate their operations with these other modes of transport. They need to have the technology and the systems in place to manage those intermodal shipments effectively. And they need to be able to offer competitive pricing and service levels to attract customers.
So it's a whole new ball game for them.
In many ways, yeah. It's a
Right.
much more complex and dynamic environment than it used to be.
Okay, let's do a quick recap here. What are some of the key takeaways we want our listeners to remember from this deep dive into the trucking industry?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is that consolidation is a major trend. We're seeing fewer but larger companies controlling more of the market. And technology is playing a big role in that, with companies using AI and telematics to optimize their operations and gain a competitive edge.
And it's not just about what's happening within the industry itself. The broader economy is also having a big impact.
Right. Tariffs and interest rates, especially, are creating uncertainty and challenges for trucking companies.
And the freight market itself is becoming more complex, with demand fluctuating in different ways depending on the sector. And with this rise of intermodal and rail transport for those long hauls,
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
it really is. So for our listeners out there, even if you don't work in the trucking industry, I think it's important to understand these trends because they affect all of us. They affect the cost of goods, the availability of products, and the efficiency of our entire supply chain.
Exactly. Trucking is such a fundamental part of our economy, so anything that affects the trucking industry ultimately has ripple effects throughout the entire system.
So here's something for you to think about as you go about your day. How do you think these changes in the trucking industry might affect you personally? What are the potential upsides? What are the potential downsides? And how do you think these changes might play out in the long run? It's definitely something worth pondering.
It is.
Yeah,
And I think it's important for us to stay informed about these trends so we can make better decisions as consumers and as citizens.
absolutely. So until next time, keep on trucking.